Welcome, everybody. My name is Haley Milliman, and my guest today is Vaseem Khan. Vaseem first saw an elephant lumbering down the middle of the road in 1997 when he arrived in India to work as a consultant. It was the most unusual thing he'd ever encountered and served as the inspiration behind his Baby Ganesh series of lighthearted crime novels. Vaseem is the award-winning author of 2 crime series set in India, the aforementioned Baby Ganesh Agency series, and the Malabar House historical crime novels. His first book, The Unexpected Inheritance of Inspector Chopra, was a Times bestseller and has now been translated into 15 languages. Vaseem also works at the University College London's Jill Dando Institute of Security and Crime Science. So Vaseem, welcome. And I want to start off by telling you something. It's not often that you read reviews for a crime book that say things like utterly charming or enchanting or that type of thing. So I want to just start off by learning a little bit about how you came to start writing, again, particularly with such kind of an intriguing idea.
Well, firstly, let me thank you for inviting the organizers of this for inviting me here, and all of the people who've taken time out from their busy day or evening or wherever you are in the world. It's a delight to be here. Okay, so the question is about, where did the inspiration come from for that first series, the Baby Ganesh series? Well, as you mentioned, I went to India at the age of 23. My parents were from the subcontinent, but they had moved to the UK, and I was born here. So I grew up here, not really knowing much about India, except what I'd learned from my parents. So to go there as a 23-year-old, for me, it was as much of a massive assault on the senses as it might be for anybody else. And this was at a time when India was making the transition from being a largely pre-industrial economy to the near global superpower that we think of her as today. And I ended up spending 10 wonderful years there. And then when I decided to come back to the UK, as you do when you've been to somewhere quite exotic, you want to try and put that into your writing. And for me, this first book, The Unexpected Inheritance of Inspector Chopra, was about trying to not only capture all of this wonderful memories of India, but to put that into a crime narrative in a way that might stand out. And I know that most of the people who are on here today are probably beavering away trying to find an angle, because that's what it's about when you're trying to get published. In the industry, what we have is mainly books that are very similar to previous books, and that's because of a phenomenon known as comping, which is short for comparing, where when you submit novels to a traditional publisher, they look at that book, they assess it, and then they decide, how many copies can we sell of this? And they do that by trying to compare it to similar kinds of books. But what they are really looking for is a book that is similar but slightly different. So for me, I looked at a series that is a favorite of mine, and it's been a favorite around the world, and it's called the #1 Ladies Detective Agency series by Alexander McCall Smith, set in Botswana, which has that similar kind of, the kind of things that you talked about, descriptors around it. It's charming, and it has a protagonist that people really want to follow because she's a good-natured human being. So for me, I use that as a template. And that's a really good lesson, I think, for anybody who's writing crime fiction, is to pick a series that is similar in vein to yours, but you have a sufficient points of difference that allow you, when you start pitching to agents, to say, look, I think that this would really appeal to fans of the #1 Ladies Detective Agency, for instance, but this is the difference that I bring to this. And that was my aim, to try and do that with that particular series.
Yeah, that's great advice. In one of the previous sessions today, we were talking about how that exact thing happens, where typically books follow a template or a formula, but there should be variation within that, right? So every book should not be a carbon copy of the books that came before, the books that inspired it, but that will help, again, get you in the door, get those meetings with publishers, get those meetings where, it gives them, again, something to compare to, right? Something to understand who the audience will be, why they should care about this book, but then you have your unique spin on it, which is great. So we were speaking before we started this webinar about how you had tried to sell several books before, or actually, I think you said 7 before you sold this series. So can you tell us a little bit about that process? And actually, even before that, have you always wanted to be a fiction writer?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess like many people here, fell in love with books at an early age, wanted to write. So I was that annoying kid in class who, when you're set a one-page, story, right, tell us where you were on your holiday, would write 40 pages and annoy the hell out of my English teacher. I wrote my first novel age 17.
Wow.
And I was reading a British author called Terry Pratchett, who writes the comic sci-fi. And so I wrote a comic sci-fi fantasy. And I sent it off to a few agents at the age of 17. And then I sat back because my contract would be coming along and I'd live a life of fame and fortune, as most authors do, right? No, of course not. I got my first set of rejection letters, which was a wake-up call to a certain extent. But when you're that young, you can't see how awful your writing is. And over the next 23 years, I wrote 7 novels across different genres. I tried to write literary fiction, contemporary fiction, more sci-fi, and crime fiction. And by the end of that period, what I can say is, other than being heartbroken quite a number of times, the quality of the writing had improved to a point where I felt quite confident with the books that I was writing. And it was only a question of trying to chance on an idea that would spark with a particular agent, and that happened to be this The Unexpected Inheritance book.
Yeah. So during that period, as you were writing and iterating, what did you do to learn? Were you, besides writing itself?
Well, I'm sure everyone's heard this before, but if you do not read a lot of books, particularly in the genre you're trying to write, it's very hard for you to improve. It's like if you want to be a top tennis player, nobody comes out of the womb being good at tennis. They spend, 10,000 balls they have to hit before they get anywhere near good enough to play professionally. And it's the same for writers. Every single day you've got to be reading and writing. And if you're not writing, you've got to be editing, or you've got to be thinking about the next idea. And it's that cumulative process of improving your craft. So I'll give you a quick anecdote. My agency is one of the oldest in the UK. It's been around for 100 years. It publishes people, it represents people like Hilary Mantel, Booker winners, etc., etc. And the agency receives something like 15,000 submissions a year. There's no way they can read all of those. So they have to do a quick sift. And what my agent has told me is that they tend to look at the first 5 pages immediately. And if those are written to a good standard, then they can, carry on with the rest. So 95% or so of submissions to agents fail because the prose quality is not of a publishable level. Yeah. And the only way that you are going to get to that level is by consistently writing. As I said, I wrote 7 odd novels, but I'd written other half-written novels that I'd never actually submitted. I must have written 1.5 million words before I was, confident enough with the standard of prose.
Yeah. So speaking about kind of the technical process of your writing, are you a writer who tends to edit as you write, or are you someone who kind of more gets the first draft out and then goes back and does that revision to get your prose up to that standard where you would feel comfortable submitting it?
I absolutely loathe having to do edits after submitting to my editor. It's not that I don't like my editor. My editor's great and always helps every book that I write. But for traditional publishers, you normally have a 4-edit process. You have a structural edit, then you have a line-by-line edit, then you have a copy edit, and then you have a final proofs edit. And I want to try and minimize my work during that phase. So I'm really, really meticulous about trying to edit as much as I can and leaving it for a while and coming back to it with fresh eyes and just constantly going through it until I'm super, super happy with it. And so I tend to edit as I go. So each day I will write about 1,000, 1,500 words. The next day I'll start by editing those words, and then I'll write the next batch. And then every couple of months I will stop for a week or 2, let it sink in, come back and re-edit everything I've written, and then carry on.
Was there anything you found different about editing in crime, editing as you were writing crime, than in any of the other genres?
Not really, because I think the process is about stepping back from your work, letting go of your own ego, because we're writers and we think that every word that we pen is gold dust, and we're shocked when people read it and are not as appreciative as we think they should be. So you have to be your own harshest critic. And I've always tried to do that. So I don't think there's a difference in process. What I think there is that crime fiction obviously has its own template and its own expectations that readers have of the genre, which is different to the expectations of a literary novel, for instance. And as long as you're meeting those expectations, and yes, there's room to innovate within that, but you've got to make sure you're, as a minimum, you're meeting those expectations. And often when you edit, you realize that you haven't ticked all of those necessary boxes. So for instance, you might realize that on the first pass that you haven't got enough alternate suspects. It's too easy to guess who the murderer is, for instance.
Yeah. And so do you have a favorite phase of editing or type of editing? Do you tend to like, kind of more developmental, looking at the content structure more than looking at the copy or the lines? Do you like any better? Do you just like them all?
Yeah, I just like it's the most necessary aspect of writing. Your own editing, and then if you're published, the editing that your editors bring to you. And also another really key piece of advice I have for people is find some friends, find some writing friends or reading friends who will critique your work on it honestly for you and give you feedback, and you do the same for them. That was what I was missing throughout my entire life, because there just wasn't the internet for a start, so you couldn't join groups, and it just was virtually impossible to find anyone to read this stuff. And that, I think, slowed down my progress in improving my work. So that's a definite must do, I think, these days.
Yeah, that's great advice. It's hard to find people, and then it's also it's hard to work up the courage, I suppose, to share to share what you've written with them as well. So, in terms of your planning process, so if you're writing 1,500 words a day, are you working from an outline? Do you tend to plan everything in advance? Do you make it up as you go along? Is it a bit of both?
So this is a bugbear with me. So I believe in meticulous planning, especially when it's crime fiction, which, as I said, operates to a certain template. Now, not everybody believes in that. And I know there are famous authors who talk about the fact that they just sit down and write a novel. Lee Child says that, he says that once a year he sits down and he starts on an idea and then he just writes the novel. And, I've met and chatted to Lee Child at various events. I mean, I sense a twinkle in his eye when he says that, because there's no way you can write really good books if you haven't at least some modicum of plotting. The reason that I think plotting is important is because, I have in the past started off with a really, what I thought was a great idea, got enthusiastic, charged off and written 20,000 words. And then I hit a wall. And it's like when you go for a job interview and you haven't prepared properly, or you go for a first date and you haven't really thought about what you're going to say to impress. And halfway through you start sweating because you don't know where you're going, and you pretend that you were an astronaut before, et cetera, et cetera. And it all goes rapidly downhill from there. And I think that's what happens to you if you haven't really thought out your plot properly. It will never be as good as, in my opinion, as a plot that's been well worked out. Now, that's not to say that there isn't room for things to change as you move along. Yeah. It's not to say that you shouldn't have freedom to throw out things that you've planned and put in new things. That's great. But if you've got that initial plan, what it will stop from happening, which often happens to people who are not yet published and don't have to deliver a novel a year, is that they get to a certain point and then they lose interest because they don't know where that plot's going. Other things happen in life and then they just don't come back to it. It's that old saying that, the easiest thing in the world is to start a novel. The hardest thing is to finish one. And a good plan, well thought out, should really help you to avoid that scenario. And I take about 3 to 4 months to plan everything with detailed scenes, put onto a spreadsheet, fiddle around with the timeline, get all of the clues and red herrings and research done. So I won't write a word until about 4 months. But then because I've done that and I have such a detailed plan, I can write 1,000 words a day and finish a novel in another 3 to 4 months after that.
Yeah, I'm a meticulous plotter as well. And I think it's for the same reason. It helps me when I don't know what to write, or if, I wake up one day and I'm like, I know I need to get 1,500 words done today, but I'm not feeling particularly inspired. If I can open up and say, okay, here's what's happening, at least I have a place to start, and at least I can begin writing without then having to just sit there and wait for inspiration to strike. Because I think just like you said, if that would, if that were the case, I would start a lot of things and then not finish them. Okay, so talking a little bit more about your process. So in that planning process, what's your process for developing characters?
So I think one of the things that you need to be able to say with any character is that, would you want to spend some time with this character, whether in a good way or a bad way, because they fascinate you. So I'll give you an example. So after I wrote the Baby Ganesh series, where the lead character is Inspector Chopra, he's a very rigid, honest policeman from the Mumbai police force, who's forced into early retirement. On his last day in office, he also discovers he inherits this baby elephant that he has to look after. I mean, the elephant is a symbol of India. It's a metaphor, right, rather than a detective or anything like that. Chopra is a serious man, and there are serious crimes he's investigating. But I invest in him the kind of qualities that I experienced when I was living in India. So he's a man who cares about social injustice, which is quite prevalent in India. If you're rich, if you're powerful, you can get away with the worst possible crimes. He cares about the fact that the police force has a terrible reputation in India for corruption and brutality and the rest of it. And he stands as a beacon of honesty and integrity against that. So when you try and draw characters like that, I think you do have to partly play on your own sensibilities and feelings about what you would like to see in a character, the kind of character you'd like to spend some time with. And then you have to find a way of making that person interesting and putting them in an intriguing setting. So if you take the second series that I write, historical crime fiction set in Bombay, which is what Mumbai used to be called, set in 1950. And this is an intriguing period of Indian history where Gandhi's been assassinated a couple of years before. We've had Indian independence, and we've had partition riots where 1 million people were killed when Hindus and Muslims fought each other when the country was partitioned as the British left. So into this mix, I needed to create a character, because my aim was to explore that period. How could I do it? What was the best vehicle to do it? I could create another police detective or a private detective. But then I thought, well, hang on, what would be the most intriguing would be for me to create a female police detective, because at that stage, there weren't any in India. And the first one didn't come along until 1960, I think. And I thought, what if I create a female police detective who is operating in a very misogynistic, paternalistic environment? Nobody wants her to be a police officer because, this is India in 1950. And then I use her eyes as the vehicle to explore this particular era and the themes that I wanted to explore.
Yeah, that's really interesting of thinking, who would serve this story? It sounds like it's like, okay, who would serve this story? Who would explore well this setting that I want to be in? Rather than, on the other hand, I think another approach could be, I have this character, what setting would serve the character, right? And I think that's just one of the things that we all as writers can think about is, do you have the idea for a place you want to explore? Do you have the idea for an event you want to explore? Do you have the idea for a character you want to explore? And that's a really fascinating way of approaching, this time and place. And to speak more a little bit about setting, so your series are set in real life places, right? And I think world building is typically something we think about a lot with fantasy and a lot in science fiction, but it's equally important in crime novels. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about your process for world building a real world place and making that come alive for your readers.
So, I mean, there's a lot of advice around this kind of thing. Yes, it does help if you've visited extensively a place that you're going to write about, because you pick up nuances of people's characters and how people behave and really talk in that particular area. So living in India for 10 years gives me that good grounding. But I didn't live in India in 1950 with my second book. So how do you do that? Well, research comes into it, and you do have to spend a lot of time researching. And there's plenty of resources online these days, so you can get lost down all sorts of rabbit holes. I would say that none of it's really wasted, because it all filters into the back of your brain, so that when you start writing. So the trick then is, when you're transferring that information to the page, how do you make it so that you don't fall into the trap of too much exposition. You don't bore the pants off of your readers. And it's a fine balance, because all fiction needs some scene setting. It needs some explanations, especially historical fiction, where you've got to set the period and the location. And I think the key is this. This is what I do. For every single scene, and there might be 60 or 70 scenes in a typical novel that I write, if I write that scene, I will then ask myself certain questions. I will say, okay, does this scene move the story forward in a tangible way? Does this scene answer a question or pose a question? Does this scene show us something about my protagonist through some action or reflection? And if the answer is no to all of those things, then that scene has absolutely no right to exist in your book. All it's doing is it's pandering to your ego, because you think you've written a really nice scene and you're loath to get rid of it. But it should be on the cutting room floor, because it does not help your reader, and you must look through all of this through your reader's eyes.
Yeah, and it seems like that advice could be applied on a micro level to editing description within a scene as well, to say, am I including this description as a nice to have because I think the world I'm playing around in is really cool? Or is it giving my reader key information that will help them understand, the character's motivations, or set up something that's going to happen in that scene as well? Just asking the question of why do I have this here?
I'll give you a simple example. So Midnight at Malabar House, which is the first book in the historical series. My initial draft, I started off with a lot of scene setting about India in 1950. And then when I put it away and I came back to it, I realized that I had 5 pages of this guff at the beginning, which was not needed. I mean, it was interesting information, but it was just me trying to show off my knowledge of 1950 India. So once I got it back, I changed things around, and now the book starts immediately with Persis, who is the female inspector. She's been relegated to Malabar House, which is the smallest and crappiest police station in Mumbai or Bombay, where all the officers that nobody wants to work with are sent. And she's doing the midnight shift. She's on her own, and a call comes in. And she's told that a very prominent English diplomat, a white man, has been murdered in Bombay. And she's the only person on call. Nobody else wants the case. So she ends up getting the case. And I use that as the opening point, which is so much more interesting. But then in the pages that follow, I then gradually seed in some of that, 1950, what India was like in 1950, as a backdrop to the fact that, she's a lone policewoman in a male police force. And it was a much more interesting way of doing things. And I think if there's one message out of all of the things we talk about today that I can get to the people who are watching today, is that put the good stuff at the front. I'm sure you all understand what I mean. Get the good stuff into those first opening pages, rather than making somebody wait for that good stuff. Because an agent I want you to imagine an agent at the end of a busy week where they've already had a couple of hundred terrible submissions, nothing that's going to earn them any money that they can take on. And they're already jaded and tired and looking forward to their first whiskey of the evening. And then they get hit something that immediately perks them up, because it begins brightly, it begins strongly, drags you straight into the narrative, and it's well written and the prose is good. And agents live for that moment. They're not ogres. They're really looking for someone who they can represent, because they only make money if they can find good authors.
Yeah, that's great advice. So can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up finding your publisher?
Right. So, well, after all of those 23 odd years and 7 rejected novels, I have to say I didn't hold out much hope. But I finished The Unexpected Inheritance of Inspector Chopra. I was in 2 minds as to whether or not to submit it. But then I thought, well, you've done the damn thing now. You might as well send it off. So I sent it off to a few agents. And I was lucky enough to get an agent. And my agent was the one who helped me to just redraft it slightly to make it a better book. And then he sent it off. And I remember I was at work when a month or so later, he called me to say, I've got your book deal. And I thought, well, I shouted because I was in, 20 years at this moment. My colleagues in the office were wondering what happened to me. But what was really good was that he said that Hachette, who are my publisher, wanted to give me a 4-book deal, which is quite rare for a first-time author, and that was because they wanted to make sure that they could build the series with me, and I thought that was a really good. For me, that was a really good start to my published writing career.
Yeah, I'll say that's great for a 4-book deal. That's amazing. You also have this fantastic day job, which I want to talk a little bit about before we get into some of the listener questions. So when I was reading your biography, you were working in hospitality, and then you're now working at the University College London in crime science. Can you tell us a little bit about how that transition happened?
Well, it's not as much of a transition as you think, because my background in finance and consulting and project management, that's what I was doing in the hospitality industry in India and China for a bit. And then I came back to the UK, and I decided that I wanted something slightly more laid back and being full-time management consultant. And so I joined the university, and using similar kinds of skill, project management, and managing academics is like herding very intelligent cats around, because they never want to do what they're told to do. It's like authors trying to get what they're told to do. But for me, it's been really wonderful working at this crime institute, because I'm surrounded by people who know the ins and outs of the scientific and technological side of what's happening in crime. So I've got an expert on DNA on hand if I want to ask her. So a couple of years ago, I was writing a short story, and I went to one of my colleagues and I said, "Can you please tell me how to burn a body alive and what happens?" But it's okay. She's a forensic anthropologist, and she was able to tell me the process of what happens to a body when you burn someone alive.
You're like, I'm a crime author, I swear. It's for my book. It's not, not for any nefarious purposes. Yeah, that's great. Well, so are there any innovations that are happening at UCL that you're really excited about that you can share with us?
No, crime writers are the opposite. They absolutely hate all of these technological innovations. And the reason is because it makes it much harder for you to write a narrative that where the culprit isn't caught in 5 minutes because they're captured on the TV cameras, or they've left some element of genetic material that is instantly picked up, and sooner or later you're on some database and you get caught. And cyber footprints now. So we do a lot of work around cybercrime, and the cyber footprints that you leave, it's very difficult. The biggest misnomer in crime fiction, but this is what makes crime fiction interesting, is the idea of the genius criminal. To tell everybody, there is no such thing as a genius criminal. Most criminals are incredibly stupid, incredibly weak. And the ones that are very successful are the ones who tend to organize themselves into organized crime gangs, and then they buy in talent. So a lot of these organized crime gangs are buying in young cyber geeks who are able to do a lot of this cyber crime for them, and they reward them immensely or threaten them to do this. But there are very few Hannibal Lecter style genius criminal masterminds out there.
Which I guess is a good thing for all of us, that there are a few. And I guess, the kind of coding montage that you'll see on TV is probably less interesting in written form than it is when you're watching it on, CSI or something like that. So before we dive into user questions, I also wanted to talk about the blog post that we were chatting about earlier, which you wrote this weekend, entitled "Am I Brown Enough?" And in this blog post, you discuss the idea that someone of a particular ethnicity or background should conform to certain expectations when depicted in fiction. So some of you have seen me on these presentations before. I am a person of color, and I am trying to pursue traditional publishing for my own novels, which are YA fantasy. And this is something I worry about a lot. I worry about needing to write about my own culture to kind of stand out from a marketing perspective, but then I also worry about, what is my own culture? How can I describe that authentically? Am I writing in a way that's authentic when my experience is different from other people of my race and background, and in general, experiences of race and background and gender and all of that are not monolithic? So I just love to know your thoughts on kind of what inspired that blog post, and then also just your experience as a person of color writing in the crime space.
Okay, so this is a topic quite close to my heart, and I suppose we all know that the topic of diversity in the creative arts in general has been big over the last few years, whether it's film or TV or the publishing industry. Now, my personal approach to it is this: that every author has the right to create whatever type of fiction they want, write whatever kind of characters of whichever ethnicity or group that they want to, as long as they do the research, they approach the subject with empathy and the desire to truthfully tell that particular person's viewpoint. Because if you didn't have that, fiction would die overnight. Mm-hmm. I couldn't write women. I couldn't write white people. I couldn't write gay people. I basically couldn't write anyone except someone who's a carbon copy of myself. So all we'd have is autobiographies. What happened was that really lit my fuse, to put it politely. There was this massive furore 6 months or so ago, where the pop star Adele had adopted a particular hairstyle. Mm-hmm. And this upset people because some people felt that she was culturally appropriating this hairstyle from
Jamaica, I think it was, or the Caribbean. Yep.
Now, I mean, I can't comment on that specific hairstyle or not, whether people were offended or not. People have a right to be offended if they felt that there was something wrong there. But in general, the whole cultural appropriation debate and how people are quickly torn down on social media and cancelled, this doesn't sit well with me, because I think authors have that right to write and to explore and push the boundaries, as long as they, as I said, do the research. And so I wrote a number of pieces around this, blog pieces, which I released on my website, and they exploded. And there were like 5,000 people around the world who read them. And I got so much mail back, people saying, thank you for voicing things that we can't voice ourselves. I think a lot of white people especially are quite frightened to say these things because of the backlash they expect. And off the back of that, for the last 6 months, I've been working with the Arts Council, which is a research council in the UK, to create guidance. So it's a project that will create some written guidance and a series of videos that I will do that will give authors around the world some advice on how to approach writing groups and cultures that are outside of your own ethnicity. And I hope to release that later this summer, in about 3 or 4 months' time. Most of the work is done. And so if anybody here who's watching today would like, it's free guidance. If you would like to receive that, possibly the best way to do that is to go to my website. I've got a newsletter. You can join the newsletter, and I will be sending the stuff out through that newsletter in due course. But it is something that I feel quite strongly about.
I just dropped the website link in the chat for anybody who missed it earlier, to stay up to date. I think that's really great to hear. And it seems like a lot of people in the chat are agreeing with that. I know we had a question previously about, have you ever been told by someone that you couldn't write about a woman detective because you're not a woman? And then someone else asked, I find it very difficult to write in my own culture. I am from India, but most of the crime thrillers I read are of Western culture. How do I learn to change the narrative to a scenery from the country I am in? And it sounds like your advice might be, don't change to something that you're uncomfortable with just because you feel like you have to. Is that right?
Absolutely right. I mean, I spent years trying to chase what I thought the industry wanted me to write. And I'll be honest with you, most of that was, I was trying to write white characters because I could not on the shelves anywhere see any books that featured non-white characters, really, not in fiction anyway. But I think at the end of the day, you are most comfortable writing when you are writing about topics that mean something to you.
Yeah.
They don't have to be from your culture, but if that topic means something to you, and there's a theme that you want to explore, the publishing industry loves a good theme. And the reason they love a good theme is because it helps them to market a particular book. So if you write a crime novel with a good theme attached to it, something that tells us something about society or, the way people behave, then they will put that ahead of another similar kind of novel, because it just gives them that extra angle when it comes time to trying to push that book to radio shows or booksellers, etc.
Yeah, Great. Okay, so let's dive a little bit more into some of the other questions that we have. So Craig says, your novel titles are quirky and fun. Where does the inspiration come from in deciding the ultimate title?
Well, not from me, that's for sure, because of the 6 or 7 published novels I have so far, I think only 2 have been titles that I have come up with and have been allowed to keep. The 5th book in the Chopra series, which is Bad Day at the Vulture Club, and that explores the Parsi community in India, which I found fascinating because they're a community that they don't bury or cremate their dead. They leave their dead out for vultures to eat because they are Zoroastrians. That's their ancient Persian religion. And so, the book follows a murder in that community, and it allows me to explore that community. But Bad Day at the Vulture Club is a riff on the old Spencer Tracy film, Bad Day at Black Rock. So I enjoyed that. And my next novel that's coming out in the UK in July is the second in the Malabar House series. It's called The Dying Day. And that's because I really love that title, because that is taken from Dante's The Divine Comedy. And this book is about, it's based on a fact. And the fact is that for 200 years, the Asiatic Society in Bombay has housed a copy of a 600-year-old copy of Dante's The Divine Comedy, one of the 2 oldest copies in the world, so they say. And Mussolini tried to buy this for about $1 million back in the 1930s, but the Indian government refused to sell. So in my book, it goes missing, purses show to investigate, murders start to happen. And, I really enjoyed writing it. And I was allowed to keep that title because it really goes well with the story and crime fiction.
Great. So when you first started the Baby Ganesh series, did you know that you would end up writing a series, or did you just start with the first novel?
At that stage, I was just 1 novel, because you've got to remember, 23 years without being published, I had no expectation that even that book would be published. So I had nothing in my mind to suggest that it was going to be more than 1 book. But what happened was that when my agent said that they wanted to offer a 4-book deal, I then had to write 3 more synopses that we had to agree with the publisher before they would sign the contract. So it was some quick thinking for a couple of months to make those.
Yeah. And so someone asked a question that probably comes with that is, how did you select and develop the crimes that form, each of the books in that series, and in your second series as well?
Okay, so I think this is one of those things where, as an author, you evolve. So Chopra starts with a single crime, straightforward crime, which is a poor boy is killed in an Indian slum. And, Inspector Chopra has to investigate. By the time I get to The Dying Day and the my later books, what you will find is that I have multiple crimes going on, multiple narratives. And somehow my job as an author is to try and bring all of that together at some point. Now, partly that there's 2 reasons for that. One is because publishers like that, because that speaks to a slightly higher level of crime writing than the normal just 1 single crime and following it straight through. And secondly, because it's more intriguing for the reader. Again, if I can give another really strong piece of advice, it's this: really good crime novels are about the questions, the puzzles and the riddles that you raise with your reader, and then you engage with your reader as you slowly show them the clues that lead to the answers to those questions and puzzles and riddles. And that's how crime fiction generally differs from, say, straight thrillers, where you've got a lot more action-oriented things going on and not so many of these puzzles. But for me, a really good crime novel is one that sets up some really intriguing, not just who killed this person, but the circumstances, the clues. A good example is The Locked Room Mystery, where it's not just about who killed this person, it's about how the hell did they manage to get into the room to kill this person. So those kind of multiple layers of questions, multiple strands of crimes and investigations, they add to the complexity and richness of a novel. And I think that really helps to sell your novel to an agent and a publisher.
Great. So someone says, or Daryl says, Inspector Chopra was willing to ignore, if not break, some of the rules of his community to house the elephant. Was that a way you made him more endearing rather than being totally rigid?
Yes, absolutely. So the one thing that you have to do with your characters is to make them multidimensional. So even even famous characters. So one of my favorite authors is Michael Connelly, who writes the Harry Bosch novel set in Los Angeles. I've never been to LA, but I feel like I know the city because I've got every single book that Michael Connelly's written. I was lucky enough to meet him because we shared the same UK publisher a couple of years ago, and she snuck me in to have a nice chat with him. And it was, a real fan moment for me personally, but also to learn how he goes about writing these books. And, he really does rely on real life, real case scenarios, because he used to be the crime reporter for the LA Times, and he still has those police contacts. And for me, and what he does with Harry Bosch, to answer this particular question, he tries to make sure that Harry Bosch isn't just this one-man wrecking ball. So he has Harry Bosch with the daughter who he has Harry Bosch in this woman that he fell in love with, who tragically dies, and he holds a torch for her. He has Harry Bosch, the jazz-loving detective. And for me, it's about trying to find something similar with my characters. And with Chopra, it was the baby elephant, to try and humanize him, humanize his rigidity. With Persis, who is the lead in my historical crime fiction, it's her father. They live above a bookshop, one of Bombay's oldest bookshops. And her father is in a wheelchair, and he's cantankerous, and he's crotchety. And, but the dynamic between them tells us something about Persis, about something outside of her very driven persona in the police force.
Yeah. So you spoke about how you've kind of felt that you've visited LA, even though you haven't been, just from reading descriptions of it. Lydia asks, how were you able to develop such rich descriptions of the Mumbai setting? And she says they were as rich as the ladies' #1 descriptions of Botswana.
Well, again, I was lucky enough to meet Alexander McCall Smith and have a chat with him. He said some nice things about the unexpected inheritance of Inspector Chopra. And so he was born in Botswana. And in his as a young man, he also went back to live there and work there for a decade or so. And my story is similar. I wasn't born in India, but I spent a decade there. And that, I think, contributes to the fact that I can be quite rich. So I'll give you a simple example. If you do a lot of Googling about India, you learn quite a bit. But what you won't see is the granularity of walking down an Indian street, where you will literally, in the space of a few hundred yards probably, you will meet eunuchs, who are the transvestite community. And they come and they bang on your car. And then when you start to learn a bit more about them, you understand they are incredibly marginalized in society. You will meet lepers. And I had thought that leprosy was done away with ages ago. I had no idea that there were still lepers on the streets of Bombay. And then you'll turn a corner and you will see the world's most expensive individual home. And it's in Bombay. It belongs to India's richest man. His name is Ambani. And it's a 27-story tower, which he built for himself, his wife, and his 2 kids, and 500 servants or whatever. And literally, there's a slum not very far away from that. And those kind of things that you can't really pick up how to describe those unless you've been to that place. You can do a reasonably good job, though. So I'm not saying that you absolutely have to go to these places.
Yeah. All right. So someone asks, how has your writing process evolved from when you first started writing?
Well, when I first started writing, my writing was crap. So I guess that's
it's gotten better.
Point. Complexity, planning complexity into my books. So I will spend lots of time trying to think of good puzzles that can surround the murder. So I generally start with the murder, and then I say to myself, what are the interesting clues or facets that I can pose at the beginning of this book that will immediately have the reader turning those pages to say, oh, I've got to find out what the hell that particular clue meant. Why did he put that puzzle there, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the single most important thing that I do now is I was talking about intertwining narratives. I try and make sure that all of my books now have this more than one crime that eventually twines together.
Yeah, and someone has a question related to that. How do you balance putting in signposts and leaving clues without sacrificing story and narrative and that type of thing?
Well, crime fiction lives and dies by the red herrings, right? Mm-hmm. Any crime novel worth its salt will have quite a few signposts, but the trick is in making sure that the signposts that seem very credible, end up taking your reader into a blind alley. And, you know, suddenly on page 82, the reader will say, oh, crap, this is, I thought I had it. I thought I knew where this was going. The way that to think about this is that readers, and you should know this from your own experiences, at any point in any book, a reader, any crime book, a reader has developed hypotheses. They have started to think, okay, I know who the killer is, or I know what this clue means. And your job is to signpost those, and then to pull the rug out from under your reader and say, I fooled you, it wasn't what you thought it was. Mm-hmm. That successfully, you have quite a good crime novel on your hands.
Speaking of your process as well, do you have any tips for getting better at editing?
Well, I think I've mentioned earlier that, you know, you should use friends or people who you trust to give you an honest opinion. So that does not mean your mom. So you know, you have to ask people for honest feedback, people who know. So there doesn't have to be another writer, but it certainly has to be someone who reads a lot of the genre that you're trying to write. So if you're trying to write cozy crime, then find somebody who reads a lot of cozy crime. There's no point asking somebody who writes serial thriller crime and who has absolutely never read a cozy crime novel. So I think that's very, very important. If you have the money to spare these days, there are a lot of very credible editing agencies out there. The thing to be aware of, though, is to make sure that you research the background of the editors who are going to be looking at your work. A lot of them would have worked for big traditional houses, and those are great. But some of them might be just fly-by-night operators who've just decided to take a chance. So just be wary, but you know, a lot of those are used by people and they do a great job giving you feedback.
Great. Okay, we have a few more minutes. So someone asks, what is missing in the crime fiction genre? Is there anything you would suggest for new writers to go after?
Okay, so the first thing you have to realize is that even the most experienced writers in the world don't really write new stories. There's no such thing as a truly new story. What you have is old stories that are either repackaged in a nice way or something slightly different has been done to that story. Maybe a new setting, maybe a new kind of character, a new historical period, or some new innovation that you've brought to that relatively familiar story that you know, gives the publishing industry something to hang its hat on and to market that particular novel. But you shouldn't be disheartened because you see it all the time. Harry Potter. Okay, Harry Potter was not a new story. You know, there had been other stories featuring boy wizards and girl wizards. This just happened to be a breakout book. I mean, it was rejected 20 times by 20 different agents, but it just happened to strike a chord at the right time and it became huge. So don't be disheartened if you can't think of that one amazing idea no one has ever thought of. That's not what your aim should be. If you can, brilliant. I've never met anyone who has, but it'd be great. And I'm talking about some of the biggest authors in the world who I've shared panels with. You know, when we have a chat afterwards, you know, they all say roughly the same thing. There's no such thing as a new story. It's about what you can bring to possibly a familiar story that's different.
So there were a couple of questions in the chat, and there's one in the Q&A about your experience writing as an Indian person, writing novels set in India with Indian characters in crime, where the majority of writers are white for white readers. And some of the questions were, you know, do you feel like you've experienced any prejudice from that? Did you feel that you needed to hide your identity or anything like that as you were approaching publishing?
I did go through the period of thinking to myself, should I use a white pseudonym instead of my own name? But my publisher have been really supportive, I have to be honest. You know, all my books have been published by Shet around the world, and they've been very good. And they said, no, you know, this speaks to your identity anyway, writing about India. So let's use your name. Let's just go with that. And I think the good news for everybody listening, watching today, is that the crime fiction community is incredibly supportive. And I've had nothing but, you know, warm responses from reviewers, from critics, from festival organizers, from other authors, from bloggers, and most importantly, from readers. And I think that partly speaks to the changing dynamic around us, which is that fiction from all over the world now is finding audiences all over the world. And we go in cycles, right? So we had tartan noir when Scottish fiction was really huge. Then we had Swedish fiction that became global. And now we have this outback noir, as they call it, which is Australia set fiction, the likes of Jane Harper, who's a really favorite author of mine. So it goes in cycles. And at the moment, I think if you can find a really good story, no matter where it's set in the world, and you can deliver it to a good standard of writing and interest, I think that you will get a good look in, because agents and the industry as a whole are actively seeking those voices. And not just because they want to tick a diversity box, but because they know that there are markets for these books outside of the old borders, where, you know, if you were in Britain, you were mainly selling in Britain or America. But now you're selling to India, you're selling to China, you're selling to readers across the globe very easily because of the digital book revolution, and because of Netflix, who are looking for stories around the world, and Amazon Prime and the rest of it. So it's no longer a very small closed shop.
Great. Okay, and our final question that we have time for. So Robert asks, had you known when writing your first book that it was going to turn into a series, would you like to have gone back and changed anything?
Hindsight is a wonderful thing, I suppose. Yeah, we can all go back and change things and make them better. I think what I love most about The Unexpected Inheritance of Inspector Chopra, my first published book, not only because that it helped me to fulfill a lifelong dream from the age of 17. You can imagine how I felt to finally get published all those years later. But because it's so personal to me. Chopra is effectively me. You know, I'll be honest, he's me. He's a middle-aged man who, you know, who comments on India and the social injustices that I saw out there, and who believes that people who commit crimes should be caught and you know, made to suffer for it. But who also has a warm heart, even though he's quite rigid. I mean, I'm not that rigid, but who has a warm heart, who loves animals, because I'm a huge animal fan. And so for me, that's what resonates about that book. Now, I could go back and tinker and maybe make the plot slightly more complex, but that book was much more about that journey that Chopra was taking from leaving the police force, trying to find a purpose for his life, deciding that he's going to investigate this poor boy's murder because nobody else in the police force cares about the poor boy in India. And then also having to come to grips with this change in his life. And this little elephant that he's inherited helps him to make that transition and that change. So it's a human story more than anything else.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. Everybody has just said that your advice has been so great in the chat and that they've just loved this session. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Anyone watching, if you are interested in keeping up with Vaseem, please visit his website. I'm going to drop it several more times just as the chat rolls in with all the thank yous. Please visit his site to see both his book series as well as just a bunch of new projects that you're working on as well. And again, I highly recommend reading Vaseem's blog. I had spent several hours going into the archives over the weekend, and it was wonderful. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you again, Vaseem, for your time.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
Am I supposed to be on this Facebook group now if there are people who are on
Yes, if you would, yes. So Vaseem has joined the Facebook group as well. So I will tag you in a post there that you can answer questions. So if we didn't get to you today, Vaseem has generously joined the Facebook group and will be chatting with us there too. So you can catch him there.
Next half hours if anybody wants to ask me anything else.
Perfect. Yes, he was talking about how he's a night owl, so you got permission to chat up and to ask some questions over the next few hours. And yes, there is a networking session coming up after this, and if anyone wants to connect with other crime writers. So with that, we will sign off. Thank you all again so much for joining us. Thank you, Vaseem, and we will catch you all in the Facebook group. Bye.
Bye.